A warm welcome to everyone at Ultimate Meaning, the Theory of Samsara. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you all Bhante Joe. Bhante Joe is a Theravāda monk of Canadian origin who is currently residing in Sri Lanka. I was fortunate the other day to meet Bhante on the Vinny Metta podcast. We're having a discussion in the Mani-sphere we call the Buddha Bros. So welcome, Bhante.
Nice to be here.
Yeah. So for all of our members who may not be familiar with your backstory, maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself. For example, how did you first come to encounter Buddhism?
Well, actually, at the time I was 18 and I was really into debating. I was actually a pretty staunch, I wouldn't call myself an atheist, but a materialist. So I completely rejected theistic religions, which not too sure how old you are, Lama, but maybe we're about the same age. I'm not too sure. Anyways, I remember at the time growing up, Christianity in the West, at least where I was from, it was still strong in my mother's generation, definitely very strong in my grandfather's generation. But in my generation, especially, many people were paying lip service to it, but were actually confused, I guess you'd say, by the philosophy. I was one of those, and actually, I was pretty highly influenced by my mother's kind of boyfriend, who became like a father figure to me. And he had this PhD. He was going for his PhD in philosophy, so he would always debate with me, and he'd be poking me and trying to find holes in the things that I said. Some people will go out and play catch with the little kids. He would argue with me. That was our version of catch. Let's have a little debate. So he was kind of a staunch non-Christian, I guess you could say, and so I think I was influenced by him.
Mm-hmm.
In any event, so taking that up, I went around kind of debating with people all the time about just about everything. And especially I would sometimes debate with Christians about religion. And I didn't know anything about Buddhism. I was just a young man. But I knew that, Christianity was very strong on this one life theory. And so just to start things off, I would tell them that I was a Buddhist, and I would say that I believed in reincarnation, which, would really poke some people. So I was just this kind of character. Just to fast forward, I've gained a lot of appreciation actually for just about every religious tradition that has genuine moral values to it. But this was my mindset at the time as a young man. So actually, there came a point where I wanted to get a girlfriend. I was 18 years old, and my mother knew that I was also, going around debating with people and saying that I was a Buddhist. So she bought me that. One day she was in the bookstore and she saw this book with a title that you would never see in Asia, which was "If the Buddha Dated." And so she bought it as a joke, because just to give it to me for the title, here you go, this is like a funny joke. And so, I took it as a joke. I just took the book and I put it aside, basically never intending to read it. But there was this one day that I actually had nothing to read. And so I was just, oh, look, there's this book. I just grabbed it up and I thought, well, I'll just kind of skim through it or whatever, just nothing to do. So I was skimming through it and, it was pretty fluffy. But I came to this one point where it said, this is the central teaching of Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths. And before reading that, I remember thinking to myself, all right, I'm going to argue with this. It's going to be full of holes, just like every other religious philosophy that I feel I've encountered. I was a bit like Melinda, and not to elevate my punya to Melinda's level, but my attitude was a bit like Melinda. I just like to go around poking holes in philosophies. So I thought, I'm going to poke holes in this. I'm going to find what's wrong with it. And, it'll be easily defeated. So I remember I read through the first truth and it was a very loose translation of them. I was like, oh, that makes sense. And I read through the second truth and it was a very loose translation. It was like, all suffering comes from attachment. And then the third truth was, in her rendition, the cessation of suffering is the cessation of attachment. And I think by the third one, I was fully converted to being a Buddhist. So it was almost like these, almost like the things you see in the Pali Canon where people go to debate with the Buddha. And, instead of that, they end up getting converted. So that was how I became a Buddhist.
I see. Yeah. So how old are you, by the way?
I'm 42 now. I'll be 43 in a few days.
Okay, I'm nearly 20 years older than you, so we're
Oh,
not the
are you?
same
Okay.
generation, but yeah.
That's a compliment.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, I take it as a compliment. So, and also, what is your ethnic origin?
My ethnic
Uh,
origin?
Do you have a hereditary? Yeah.
My mother is, well, it's a, typical Canadian story, or increasingly typical Canadian story. My
Yeah.
mother is part German and part English, but there's probably other things in there. And then my father is Nigerian.
Hmm.
So
Oh,
my last
interesting.
name is
Okay.
German. I have a German last name
Oh,
because coming from my
do you speak
grandfather.
German?
No, no, no. I barely even
Sprechen Sie
speak my
Deutsch?
last name.
Okay. No, I was just wondering if there was some sort of hereditary link with Buddhism. My grandmother was a Son Buddhist, so I had some kind of link there initially. So, as I understand it, then you initially started off in Zen Buddhism. Is that correct? Was that the first thing
Yes,
you
that's
encountered?
correct. Hmm. Yeah, I started in Zen. Yeah.
So, could you tell us a little bit about that, how it influenced you, but also why you transitioned over into the Theravada tradition, and also how it is you decided to eventually, go forth and move to a monastery in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, I mean it's a series of long stories. As far as the Zen Buddhism, what I found was that I was attracted to the Four Noble Truths. I really gelled with what they taught, but I didn't know anything about Buddhism. So the very first encounter I actually had with Buddhism was the Dalai Lama, like my deeper dive, because he was so well known at the time. So I thought, well, where do I learn about Buddhism? Let's find something by the Dalai Lama. So more or less. So I went to a bookstore and I found this book called The Art of Happiness, which I was actually very interested in because when I was a young man, even before I encountered Buddhism, there was this one time we were in class and the teacher asked us, she said, "What do you think the purpose of life is?" And so all the kids were putting up their hand, it's to be a good person. And, those ones tended to get the best marks. So I put my hand up and I said, the purpose of life is to be happy. And, what else is it was this kind of insight that I had, I felt at the time. And she said, no, no,
Hmm.
that's wrong. But I was totally convinced by this. So I was going around basically trying to live my life almost in a quasi scientific personal experiment to try to find what it was that made me happy or made other people happy. And so when I first encountered Buddhism, that was what immediately gelled with me in the Four Noble Truths. Oh, here's a whole religion that's devoted to happiness. Like it just made immediate sense. So one of the first books I saw in the bookstore that jumped out at me was the Dalai Lama's The Art of Happiness. So I first read that and was going through that. So I was very enraptured with the philosophy of Buddhism. And I really liked the Dalai Lama's writing, and I really liked how, it was a description that happiness was a skill you could develop. But I found that what I was doing was going around and essentially like, being kind of a bit of a missionary or, like how to say, like maybe proselytizing isn't the best word, but one of these new
Mm.
converts who just goes around talking with everybody about their new faith to the point where they're all getting annoyed. And,
Yeah, the
I was
annoying new Buddhists, right?
yeah, I was kind of a little bit, I guess you'd say I was so taken with the philosophy. I was one of these people who'd like, seen the light, so to speak, and I was just going around talking about it. And so thinking about it and philosophizing about it gave me a certain joy during that period. But I found that I guess it would have been after a few months, maybe 4 months, 3 or 4 months, that essentially this feeling, this kind of high that I had from thinking about the philosophy started to wear off and the old suffering that I had started to come back. So I realized that I was going to have to do something else if I actually wanted to address the problem of suffering in my life, which was what attracted me to Buddhism. So I thought, well, I better learn how to meditate. There was just these very brief descriptions in The Art of Happiness. So I thought, I better try to take a deeper dive. So Google was pretty new at the time. So I just Googled Buddhism Toronto, and this Zen Buddhist temple was the very first hit that came up. So I just went there, and they had a meditation course. And so that's essentially how I started getting into Zen Buddhism, was through the desire to meditate. So it was very good. I mean, the Zen tradition had kept the meditation tradition quite strong. In Theravāda, until the modern era, we actually lost a lot of our meditative traditions through a document called the Atthakatha that was written in Sri Lanka, which essentially elevated study very strongly over practice and very strongly downplayed practice. So from about the 5th century AD onwards, Sri Lanka lost its arahants. Most of them. In folklore, the last arahant in Sri Lanka was 600 AD, about. And then what we now know as Theravāda Buddhism in Thailand and Burma came from Sri Lanka in like the 11th or 12th century. So what that means is that Theravāda was this very heavily scholastic tradition until the modern era through the Thai forest tradition and revivals in Burma, especially through the Thai forest tradition and revivals in Burma, which Sri Lanka picked up on. So what I found was that going around and looking at Theravāda places, I was not finding any meditation programs. There was just nothing that was so practical. So it was Zen and Mahayana that really seemed to have this culture of practice. So I started there. I dived into there. And I was practicing there, meditating there, and gradually I started to become more involved. So eventually, when I was in my first year of university, I decided instead of like moving out into a dorm to move into the temple. So they had these residential programs where you could actually go and stay at the temple as a resident. So I took that up, and then I took on their part-time priest training program as well. So they, in Zen Buddhism, in some traditions, you don't have to be a celibate person. You can become like a married priest or like a married minister kind of thing. So I started taking their program to train for that at the same time I was in university. And then there was this one time that I went on a retreat. What I was doing at the time was I was using Buddhism to supplement my life. So I was, using meditation. I was using the practices that the Buddha laid out to basically try to do things like get better grades and to, become a more efficient, become like a more efficient worker. That was my idea of where happiness lies. Just subconsciously, I think, right? Just kind of just take that on. And so there was a certain point where I went on this retreat. I was going on all these retreats, and I was even doing things like before exams, I would meditate and then I'd walk directly into the exam. And I was just like this meditation enhancer. So I was like breaking up my study breaks with meditation breaks, try to become more focused. And so meditation was taking on a growing role in my life. And there was a certain point where I went on this one retreat. And after the retreat, I was feeling happy. And so I thought to myself, something, the happiness that you're getting from meditation is greater than the happiness that you're getting from your lay life. And I liked my lay life. I liked what I was studying in school. So it was this tipping point, whereas it was this realization that instead of meditation supporting my lay life, actually my lay life was getting in the way of my meditation. So one of those kind of intuitions. And I was actually quite frightened by the intuition, to be honest. So after some time, I actually left the Zen temple for about 6 months. I got kind of a little bit freaked out by that intuition. I went and returned to stay at my mother's house for about 6 months, but something, it just felt really wrong, what I was doing. So it was kind of like there was a voice almost in the back of my head screaming at me, like, you better go back. So I did go back. And when I went back, I actually ended up quitting school and joining that Zen temple full-time in their full-time priest training program. But I came to realize that actually I was much more, over time, I just came to realize I was much more doctrinally aligned with Theravāda Buddhism as opposed to Mahayana.
Right.
Although I have a huge amount of gratitude from the time that I spent in the Zen temple. It's just, the doctrines. I just felt that I was much more doctrinally affiliated with Theravāda. So there was this very lucky thing that happened was there was one time I was just sitting in the Zen temple and I was studying. They'd given me this book to study about all the different forms of Buddhism. And it was really nice to read about them. So I was reading through the book and this thought came into my head, like, why aren't there any arahants anymore? Like, that's like, for example, why can't I just go out and offer alms food to an arahant right now in Toronto? Like, how come I don't know where any are? And then the thought occurred to me, the answer just showed up in my, kind of the thought occurred to me. Well, nobody's living like they do at the time of the Buddha. So that's why there's no arahants. Now, of course, we know that there's people who are practicing very sincerely in Tibetan and Theravāda and Mahayana, but I didn't know about them that well at that time. So then soon after that, just as a stroke of good luck, this series of a set of free distribution books arrived from the Thai forest tradition. And it was a book called Patipada. And this book detailed the lives of the early monks of the Thai forest tradition, how they practiced, how they lived, and the results that they were getting from their practice. And so I was reading through this book and I thought, this is amazing. These monks are living like they did at the time of the Buddha, and they're getting the same results that they did at the time of the Buddha. So I was very inspired, and I thought I should try to join the Thai forest tradition. And then another stroke of good luck happened in that a member of the temple who was a priest there, he said, there's a retreat that's going on just about 10 minutes walk from here. It's being led by Ajahn Viradhammo, and he's a Theravāda monk in the Thai forest tradition. So that happened like a month later. So I went to the retreat, and then I learned at the retreat that they were actually establishing the very first aranya in Canada that was capable of training monks in English. So there's 2 or 3 aranyas in Canada, as you may know, in the forest tradition. There's actually almost nowhere in Canada you can train to become a forest Theravāda monk in English or even in any other language. There's just not that many aranyas that are capable of doing that or have set themselves up to do that. So I learned that they were starting this new place. And so about 4 or 5 months later, 6 months later, I went there and became an anagarika. And that was where I eventually ended up ordaining as a Buddhist monk. So that's a bit of a story as to how I became a monk. As to how I ended up in Sri Lanka, that's a whole other story. Would you like me to tell it concurrently? Or
Yeah, well, I was wondering, what were you studying at the time when you were at university? Because you seem quite educated.
I was studying...
When you were attending the Zen Center. Okay.
Yeah. That's what a lot of people say.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine how that might not have been that appealing, to tell you the truth. And what sort of instructions were you getting in the Zen tradition?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm glad you asked. So they were doing what they called hwadus, or what's known in Japanese as koans. In Korean Zen, they have a more limited number of hwadus or koans, and you stick with them for quite a long time.
Was this a Korean Zen center?
Korean Zen. That's right.
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, Hwatu koan, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so
they've got the Mu koan, and yeah. I recently went to Korea and interviewed the Zen master there. So we discussed that a little bit. So you were doing a lot of zazen sitting, and you were also given a koan, were you?
Yes, yeah. He gave everybody a hwadu. Well, eventually. So at first he would have you count your breath back down from 10. And then sometimes he would switch it up. Maybe he would make you count up. I can't remember. And then there were also practices where you did a lot of chanting. I don't know if that's done in the Tibetan tradition, but you do chanting and you listen to the sound of the chant. So the general idea was what we would call sati sampajanya in Pali, this practice where you're trying to be aware of what you're doing when you're doing it. And so you could apply that to chanting, or especially you could apply it to the breath. And it was rigorous. I mean, it was really nice. That tradition has some sincere meditation practitioners in it, especially in Korea. And he had tried to transpose that to the modern West and teach it to lay people living in Toronto. And I think he kept some of the rigor in those meditation retreats that they had in Korea, but on a much lesser scale. I mean, we weren't monks.
Oh, we've lost your audio there.
Oh, no, I'm still here.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I had looked into Korean Zen Buddhism initially when I was trying to make my decision what tradition to follow. And part of the reason was because my grandmother's a Son Buddhist. But I found that there was basically nothing available at the time in London all those years ago. But I have great respect for their practice. I think it's quite limited in terms of study, though. Also, I found that. But I don't know how it manifests in the West, compared to the tradition in Korea itself, because they do study quite a bit in Korea.
Yes, they do. Yeah, I think you can.
Did you encounter any? Yeah. Well, you have these days, in order to enter the temple, if you're a foreigner, you have to get a master's before you can even enter the temple now. Many years ago, they would accept basically any Westerner who seemed keen, but they found many of them would kind of show up and then not stick with it and leave after some time. And then they started being very, very stringent. You have to learn the Hangul language and this is Chinese script that's used in Korean to study the scriptures, and you have to memorize a few sutras, I believe, the Vinaya Sutra, and you also have to get a master's before you can even enter the monastery now. So it's really difficult. And so initially, you took ordination in Canada, in Toronto, is that correct? Within the Thai Fortis tradition. And so how long ago was that?
So I ordained not in Toronto, outside of Toronto, about I think 2.5 hours outside there, in a small town called Stanleyville, outside of Perth, Ontario. So they have Toronto. It's got very good parks, but not many forests. So to have a forest monastery, you need to be located in one. Okay. So we had to go. They had to establish it out there. So I've been a monk now for 15 years since my ordination as a full monk, but I was at that monastery for about 2 years before that, because you have to spend 1 year as a layman keeping the 8 precepts. Then you have to spend another year as a samaner keeping the 10 precepts. And then if everybody's satisfied and you're satisfied, then you can request full ordination. And then after that, you have to stay under a teacher for 5 years. So the training period is about 7 years total in the Ajahn Chah tradition in the West.
Yeah, I'm really impressed with the Ajahn Chah tradition in general. I spent some time at Amaravati in London and spoke to some of the monks there. And I was really impressed in how authentic they are, because that basically follows the Vinaya structure. And it's sadly, in many places, they don't have this mentality anymore, because they're kind of desperate to get people on board, and then they'll accept anybody. And I think that's a mistake. I think it's really important to have that period when you can see if you're suitable for monastic lifestyle, and also to see if you will fit into the community. So I have to say, I only have good things to say about the Ajahn Chah tradition. We also have one here in BC as well. And so then how did you end up, or what made you decide to go to Sri Lanka?
Yeah, that's another good question. Basically, there's this kind of, I guess you could say, dream that many young monks have, especially in the Thai forest tradition, to live like they did at the time of Ajahn Mun, who was the founder of the Thai forest tradition. And Thailand used to have these very vast forests. The whole country was almost covered by forest. It's a relatively large country, and the monks would wander through this forest, and they would stay in the forest hanging these umbrella tents from tree branches, staying at the roots of trees. This is a very free lifestyle. It was that lifestyle that inspired me when I was a young man to want to join the Thai forest tradition. Unfortunately, what happened going onwards was that in Thailand, they actually ended up cutting down a lot of their forests, like huge portions of their forests. So there's a joke now that all the forests in Thailand are in the forests are in the forest monasteries, like within the walls of the forest monasteries. So actually, sometimes it is like that. You have pretty good forests within the walls, which can be like 100 acres or more, and outside is town. So the culture of practice is still there in Thailand. They do have some forested areas, which can be quite nice, but the ability to just pick your things up and wander is not the same as it once was. And as you know, being in Canada, establishing a hermitage, Canada has beautiful forests. I mean, yeah, the videos of took a look at the videos of your hermitage, and it looks like a really nice place. I keep hearing how beautiful BC is, but I've never been. But
yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, I keep hearing. Yeah, and so Canada in general, it just has a stunning wilderness, stunning forest, but there isn't the same capability, both from the side of the government or from the general knowledge of the people, to just go and live in the forest and wander. It's just, it's illegal.
You'd be arrested.
Probably be arrested. I mean, probably even before you got to the forest, you might.
And it's a lot colder, than Sri Lanka and Thailand as well.
Yeah, a lot colder. 6 months of the year. Many people don't know the winter is actually like 6 months in many places, at least in Ontario. Yeah.
Well, BC is a bit more mild than Ontario, but it still gets a bit cold.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the thing I keep hearing about BC. But
the other problem you have is even if you go off into the wilderness, you might get eaten by a grizzly bear as well. So that's a bit difficult.
Right. I've heard stories about people there was one layman who was camping, and he was just out in the forest, and apparently the BC government gives you permission to stay. he had some really inspiring encounters, like almost like the Thai forest masters, where he'd be like sleeping in a tent and a grizzly bear would come up and slap his feet. And he's just sitting there
Yeah.
watching his breath, the grizzly bear sitting there, and then eventually it went away.
No, I
But yeah,
considered these things when I came back to Canada. I decided that I should do something beneficial and to create a hermitage would be good. But I thought about the logistics of, for example, living in public parks and in the wilderness. But there's definitely issues there, you know. Whereas there is an infrastructure in Thailand, in Sri Lanka, in Burma, etc., in Tibet, whereby you can actually do this sort of thing. You can go in Nepal to a cave somewhere and meditate, and people will show up and give you food, for example.
yeah,
So because
yeah.
they have faith. But in Canada, most people, especially around here, people like Buddhism, but they certainly don't identify with it. They don't really have any in-depth knowledge of Buddhism, and they don't understand the aspect of providing for mendicants. So really, I have to try to think of a system, create or be creative with my means of supporting a community, and it's quite difficult.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, I lived I lived in Canada as a monk for almost 10 years. And yeah, I know what it's like. I think Canada has a lot of potential to become a very good place to practice with its forests and everything. But one thing is Canadian people are, we're very polite. So actually, in some senses, it works against finding out what's going on at like hermitages or finding out what's going on with monks, because you'll be there with your bowl, you'll be on alms round, and people will see a monk, they'll just be like, "Hello," and then
Yeah,
how's it going? They won't be like, "What's going on with your robe?" Or like, like, "What's up with that? What's
yeah,
up? What do you have under? Is that a bowl?" Like, it's just like, "Hello." Yeah. So I mean, it's really lovely, lovely culture,
yeah,
and of course, as a Canadian, I really love it there. But if you're
yeah,
someplace else like America or Australia, where the people are a little more forward, they'll be like, "What's up with your robe?" And what's up with your bowl? And so they
yeah,
kind of delve into that. So I think in the future, maybe once you get your hermitage established, people start to understand what it's about. Then yeah, these
yeah.
things I think can be very strong in Canada. But I think it has a different cultural model than some other places.
Certainly, and if we look at the history of the spread of Buddhism, then it's not something that happens overnight. So really, I'm thinking about what potentially might happen in the future. So was this something that kind of inspired you to go to Sri Lanka? The fact that there is already established communities and teachers?
Not so much the teachers, but that there's forest in Sri Lanka. Actually, Sri Lanka has very stunning forest. I think it's probably the best forest out of the three main Theravāda countries. They've actually done quite a good job of preserving it, and they have a culture that's kind of, I guess you could say, closer to the Indian cultural sphere. Thailand it is part of, it does take on elements from the Indian cultural sphere, but also the Thais or Chinese coming from China. That's where they came from. So Thai culture is kind of a
Hmm.
mix of both East Asian and South Asian culture. Sri Lanka is a little bit more influenced, much more influenced by South Asian cultures, almost zero influence from the Far East. So what you see here, which I was attracted to after having done my training, is that people have like this instinctive culture of providing for monks in almost a way that they're like rishis, like almost like their
Hmm.
job is to meditate. The lay people's job is to provide food, and that's it. They actually have quite a strongly established tradition here of monks living in solitary locations. They just go for pindapata. The lay people offer them food, and they go back to their place, and that's all that happens, pretty much. Like nothing else happens. So I was attracted to try that model out because I'd read about it in the suttas. It kind of go into solitude, dwells heedful, withdrawn, ardent, and resolute. And it seems like they're living in these remote locations, sometimes alone. So I was curious to try that out. So that was one of the things that really strongly attracted me to Sri Lanka. Another thing was that I'd heard about this monk named Jnanadeepa Bhante. He's actually a Western monk, but he had become very famous at the time, relatively famous among forest monks at the time when I was a young monk, because he lived this life where he would go off into very deep forest locations and he would establish these solitary kutis with three walls, usually made out of mud. And then he would live there
Hmm.
for like a year or two, and then he would leave and he would go to another forest and he would start another kuti. So he had done this for decades. And as a result, Sri Lanka started to have this tradition of living in the solitude of the forest. and kind of, the ability to wander. So it had some of these elements that I was really attracted to in the early Thai forest tradition. So I wanted to come and meet him too. So it was actually through a series of very good fortune, a series of fortunate events that I actually was able to meet him and spend about 6 months with him before he passed away, right when, in the last year of his life. So those elements really attracted me to Sri Lanka. And, to be honest, they are here in abundance. If monks or even lay people want to find places where they can just be alone, I guess you'd say, with like minimal group involvement and practice more or less independently, that's available in spades in Sri Lanka.
Mm. And you said that you didn't really come to Sri Lanka for teachers, but are there teachers there where you are at the moment? Do you get instruction?
No, not really. So it's not that there aren't monks who practice meditation. There are monks who practice meditation here. Sri Lanka is much more strong in study as opposed to meditation. If you're to compare it to Thailand versus Burma, so Thailand, the Thai forest tradition is in some ways like a little bit anti-study, not totally anti-study, but it's pro-meditation, pro-practice. The Burmese tradition, from what I've seen, seems to be like a little bit more like balanced in some, maybe balance isn't the right word, but they give emphasis to both study, especially of the Abhidhamma and the commentarial texts, and they give emphasis to meditation. It's very technique-oriented meditations. The Sri Lankan tradition is very focused on study. So like they have quite a lot of studying going on here. Some monks do meditate. The monks who are Sri Lankans here who meditate, they're influenced by Burmese meditation techniques quite heavily. I would say the foreign monks who come here are, if you were to take the community of foreign monks, there's probably interest in meditation if you were just to take the whole community as a body, not just in numbers. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of people, a lot of Sinhalese monks are interested in meditation, but just as a body, probably if you were to take the culture that exists among, say, expat foreign monks living here, they tend to be more interested in meditation. So if you wanted to look
many?
for not many. There's 20 or 30. So if you wanted to look for something like this, if you wanted to look for a teacher, what you're looking at is people, either monks who've ordained in Sri Lanka generally who are trained in a Burmese tradition. So Mahasi or Pawak, there's very big monasteries devoted to those two. Or you might be looking for a foreign monk who's what they call like EBT based. There's a lot of the foreign monks here are kind of like more into EBTs, early Buddhist texts. So they essentially read the suttas on their own, and then they come up with their own ideas about how to meditate. And they often do, they're often spending significant amounts of time in meditation. So those are the kind of options that you have for teachers. I would say that for myself, if I was looking for teachers, I would look in Thailand personally. But here, the practice environment is excellent. And it's not that there aren't any monks who teach. It's just that, what I've seen is that the standards of training are extremely high in the Thai forest tradition. And so actually, just not to beat around the bush, that's what I recommend people to do. If you want to come to Sri Lanka, do your training first, somewhere where there's good training, where you're actually, people are going to be molding your behavior. And then when you want to search for solitude, when you want to practice on your own, then come here. Because even the teacher, like even the places where there are teachers here, I mean, some are more than others. There isn't really this culture of systematic training. There's quite a lot of freedom, but there isn't like a culture of systematic training. So if you don't grow up in a Buddhist country or a Buddhist culture, as we were talking about with the Koreans, then, I mean, you can just be like a Westerner who hasn't really changed much. You know what I mean? You've probably seen that in
shave your head and wear some robes.
Yeah,
being exactly as you were. Yeah.
exactly.
Do you have study opportunities associated with your monastery where you're at the moment? Do they have study groups, etc.?
I don't usually stay at large and established monasteries. That's not really what I came to Sri Lanka for. So mostly I've been living alone, independent, or in small groups. There was one monastery that I stayed at that was a little bit larger, but I wouldn't go there to study. I don't have a lot of faith in these post-canonical texts. Like especially the study of the commentaries is very strong here. And from my research, I believe that the commentaries are actually what led to the fall of practice in Theravāda Buddhism in the 5th century. So I'm really not that inclined to study them in depth. If you compare them with the suttas, when you just go a short ways into studying them, you see enormous errors, and it doesn't take much. It's just that in the time they were composed, Pali was held behind a wall. Like, you essentially had to go to these very well-established monasteries to learn it thoroughly. And so those were also the monasteries where the commentaries existed. So once you learn Pali and you start to notice these discrepancies, you're not going to argue with the chief monks who are there at this very well-established institution. You learn Pali because of them. You access these physical texts because of them. In the modern era with digital text, it's just very easy to see the errors in the commentary. Some of them are clear. So I have very little interest in studying those. I have very little interest in studying post-canonical texts like the Abhidhamma or so, because they focus on things that are not really essential to training the mind. They're essentially talking about what they got really into ultimate reality. And so people can spend their whole life studying this stuff and not spend any time at all almost training their minds, which is the point.
And so you're fluent in Pali?
I wouldn't say I'm fluent. I did spend about 2 years studying it. So, especially among Western monks, as you may know, I imagine it's the same in the Tibetan tradition. When things get translated into English, and especially into Western culture, people input their own ideas into that. And so there's debates that go along that revolve around the meanings of terms that are contained in the Pali Canon. And so I wanted to be well versed enough that I could know if people were saying something true or something false. So I learned Pali essentially to the degree necessary to do that, which, you don't have to be fluent such that you can read it and understand it as if I was reading English, but you have to be good enough that you understand the grammar, and with the help of dictionaries, you can basically determine whether or not somebody's trying to pull the wool over your eyes or whether their interpretation is just a gloss based on what they've translated. So I know it to that degree.
So you spend your personal time in your own study, and how much time do you spend per day in that?
It wasn't a lot. It was over a number of years. So it was 2 years that I had a formal teacher, but even before that, I was studying. So it would vary. I think sometimes it would be like an hour a day, not like 8 hours a day or anything like this. You could become pretty fluent if you studied it to that degree.
Yeah. I'm also referring to the sutric studies. You obviously
studies,
do
yes.
your studies on your own. You do your studies on your own.
Yeah, it would have been a lot more in the early days, like when I first came to the monastery, especially the suttas and the Vinaya. I spent more time, I guess you'd say, studying the Vinaya in detail because it's not as intuitive. Like, you actually literally have to know what's being said there, otherwise you won't know what to do. The suttas.
Yeah, it's the same in the Tibetan translations. It's all concise down to terminology, and it just doesn't make sense unless you know what it's referring to.
Yeah, it's good to know the actual language sometimes. The suttas I learned over
And what
time.
is the language you use to communicate in Sri Lanka? Lots of Indians speak English, but to communicate within the monastery, etc.
If you're in a Sinhalese monastery, you'll use Sinhala. But a lot of people here speak English, which is another example because it was kind of a European colony for about 400 years. So English is very strong here, just like it is in India. And actually, if you want to learn Sinhalese, sometimes when you speak to people in Sinhalese, they'll speak back to you in English. So they want to speak in English. They want to learn English from you, and you want to learn Sinhalese from them. So you get into this little bit of a struggle. Like, you say something in Sinhalese, they say in English. Whoever's is better, eventually that carries the day, and you end up speaking in that language.
In the Tibetan-speaking circles, then if they speak back to you in English, it means your Tibetan's not good enough yet. But if you've got pretty good Tibetan, then they'll speak to you in Tibetan. But it feels very uncomfortable when many Westerners try to communicate because they don't know the language that well. So I presume then before you went to Sri Lanka, you'd already kind of established a practice. You must have studied various techniques, etc., for your practice in the wilderness. If you don't have instruction there,
Yeah. I think it's pretty common among people who ordain in the West that actually they'll begin with Buddhism through study. Like, most people come to it through reading. So most monks who are ordained, who are born and raised in like Canada, the United States, or wherever it might be, kind of Western monks, for lack of a better word, because of the education system and because of the culture that's there, a lot of them will actually be pretty well read. in the doctrinal text of whatever tradition they're in, whether it's Tibetan or Zen or whatever it is. They're usually pretty well read. That's what I found. But it's usually self-study. Like they don't go to school or university for it. And they usually end up testing their understanding with each other in debate. So it's usually quite a lot of, this kind of debate tradition just in Western culture in general. So that's where you'll tend to find the doctrinal knowledge of Westerners comes from. And especially, say, in the Theravāda tradition, what you might say the scholarly output of Western foreign monks, often it takes the term of debate. It often takes the form of debates, where one monk will be teaching in a particular way, and then another monk will be like, look, that's not in line with the Pali Canon. They often don't say their names, but they'll come up with a whole set of other essays or so that show why that particular interpretation is incorrect. So, yeah, I mean, I kind of grew up in that environment, I guess you'd say. And so my scholarly studies of Theravāda Buddhism are shaped by these debates that were going on at the time, and my readings into the Sutta Pitaka, for my own personal practice, but also based on the currents that were there at the time that I was ordaining.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of your actual meditation practice that you must have established before you went to Sri Lanka, then, for example, what do you meditate on when you practice?
Yeah, so it can change. So that was one of the things that I was really attracted to when I went to Theravāda was, you don't have like one technique that you have to do. I really appreciated the Huadu technique. Not to say that I didn't appreciate it. I really appreciated it, and it was very beneficial. But I still remember when I first went to the monastery, I was thinking to myself, I'm going to practice a Subha, because it was just one of these things you weren't allowed to do. So I experimented with that right away and experimented with metta. And the meditation topics that I've tended to use throughout my life, they change. So for the first number of years, for about the first 10 years that I was meditating, I was doing a lot of breath meditation, roughly 10 years. And then I started doing samasubha, and then I found that metta was a very good fit. And then eventually I switched back to doing a subha full time. And eventually that started to feel like, something was, I better switch again. So I switched again. So there's this sutta in the Pali Canon called the Sudha Sutta, which means the simile of the cook. And in that sutta, the Buddha describes a cook who places various curries on a table. And then they watch which curries their master takes. And whatever curry their master takes, they put out more of that curry. So then he says, if a cook is skillful in this way and observes what their master takes, puts out more, then they're rewarded with wages. Why is that? Because they know the chitta nimitta, or the theme of their master's mind. So he says, in the same way, a skillful monk, when he knows the theme of his own mind, is rewarded with a pleasant abiding here and now. So what that means is that essentially as a practitioner, it's not the case in the Pali Suttas that you have a technique that you do all the time. The Buddha has given many, many different instructions, which are almost like medicine. And you're to use them as medicine to cure the diseases that exist in your mind. So you can tell you're advancing in your meditation if your good qualities are increasing, your bad qualities are decreasing, and you're developing dispassion towards the things that you used to have passion towards that would bind you to suffering. So it isn't a one-off. In the Thai forest tradition especially, it's taught as a skill. And so that skill is something which will require the development of different meditation topics for different people, depending on their character traits. So yeah, I've switched throughout my monastic life. There's the freedom to do that in the Thai forest tradition. But I did, as I mentioned, stay under teachers. And what they tend to look for when you're training in the Thai forest tradition is not so much like what meditation topic you're using. They look at your behavior, and they look at how they feel you're developing in terms of your good and bad qualities. And, they'll also look for certain things like, is this person able to achieve concentration? But if you're able to do the milestones that are set out in the Pali Canon, the way that you do them, like the means by which you do them, is not so important as the fact that you can do them. Like you're able to become a good person. They're really concerned with the good qualities that you display. That's what I've seen in my training is some of the most serious teachers, the ones who are arhants, are concerned about your meditation, but really on the ground, the things that you're going to get trained in are if you're able to display good qualities and if you're able to not display bad ones. So my meditation practice personally revolves around those three things, trying to increase the good qualities of my mind, decrease the bad ones, and to purify the mind, to become more dispassionate. So the topics that I use, they change depending on the situation.
And when you refer to topics, are you talking about focal objects, or are you talking about contemplating, for example, four thoughts that transform the mind, etc.?
Sorry, the last part I didn't catch. Rather than meditation topics, what was the other thing that you?
I mean, when you say meditation topics, do you mean by that you're contemplating something, for example, the impurities of the body, etc.?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, meditation topics or objects of meditation in the Theravāda tradition, there are ones that are contemplation based, and those are called sanya topics. So oftentimes we hear about like the tilakkhana, the three marks of existence, like anicca, dukkha, and anatta. In the Pali Canon, they're not called marks. So the Buddha's not referring to them as an ultimate reality or some kind of mark of reality you're trying to see. He calls them sanyas. He calls it anicca sanya, dukkha sanya, anatta sanya. So these are perceptions that you develop in order to overcome certain bad qualities that are in the mind that are developed through thinking. So you can use thinking to counter bad qualities. And these are considered objects of meditation. It's just they're perception objects. You keep your thinking within the terms of that object in order to be developing that particular object. So if you're, for example, contemplating anicca sanya, you're developing anicca sanya, then you think about anicca, right? Like you don't think about the body. I mean, you could think about the body, but it's in relationship to anicca. So you wouldn't have anatta as your focus at that time. There's also other topics which you might call more calm-based topics. And these will also require an element of perception. So like the breath is one, metta is one, the four Brahma Viharas. These topics, you also have to develop perceptions in relationship to them, because you find that as you're trying to focus just on the breath, say, and not allow stray thoughts to arise, there's certain perceptions that you can hold in mind about the breath that will make the mind more calm than others. So depending on how you perceive and conceive the breath, that affects the way in which your mind reacts to certain emotional states. So you can gain quite a lot of insight just through breath meditation. So in any event, you have these topics which in broad camps you can divide into ones that are more focused on just developing calm through a single object, and others that you can divide into camps where you're focused on developing perceptions. And when I refer to meditation topics, I'm referring to the whole range. So it depends on your personality, it depends on your defilements, which ones you're going to use and which ones you end up taking on as your primary ones for moving forward in the Theravāda tradition, as I understand it, laid out in the Pali Canon.
And so one last question, a technical question. It's something that many people are interested in, and that's the difference between Samatha and Vipassanā. And many people give different presentations of this. And the terms, for example, in Tibetan are different than the terms there that are found in the Thai forest tradition. So from your own experience, how would you define or how would you differentiate between these two types of meditation?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, if we're going to use the words Samatha and Vipassanā, I mean, shamatha, they'll be the same words in Pali and Sanskrit, essentially, in the Pali traditions and also the the Tibetan traditions. But in, say, like the Pali Canon, just full stop the Pali Canon, they're not referred to as meditation topics. So that's a later commentarial division, which I mean is not totally unreasonable. But the issue with it is that it became that these were techniques that you had to do rather than qualities of mind that you cultivate for a particular purpose of becoming a better person, reducing your bad qualities, developing dispassion. So in the Pali Canon, they're not referred to as meditation techniques, they're qualities of mind. Samatha is a quality of mind, Vipassanā is a quality of mind, and both of those qualities of mind, in order for a meditation practice to be successful, they'll both need to be employed. But the degree to which you're employing them is going to be different depending on the topic. So obviously, if you're cultivating anatta sanya, say, or, cultivating the perception of the foulness of the body, they call it a subha sanya, then that's going to involve a lot more of the development of perceptions and the Vipassana quality of mind. The Vipassana quality of mind essentially is equated somewhat with discernment, the ability to separate things out and the ability to take things and use the rational faculty to, say, like, generate discrete perceptions and evaluate the results that you're getting. The samatha aspect of mind is more one which is calm and stable. And it's kind of, it's this quality of mind which is not agitated as things move and doesn't move much. It stays increasingly still and also has feelings of bliss and ease associated with it. The Vipassana quality of mind is not necessarily blissful and easeful on its own. I mean, you can get intellectually interested in developing a perception. It's more hard work. Like it's hard work to develop a perception. So in order even say for like, we'll use a Vipassana practice, or say like I'll use the word sanya. We'll use a more sanya-based practice as an example. In order for that to succeed, you have to have enough calmness of mind that you can basically stay on the topic. Because when you're thinking about anicca, let's use the example of the foulness of the body. If you're thinking about the various ways the body could be foul, you want it to stay on that topic of investigation in such a way that you can see why your mind thinks that the body's so beautiful when, say, you're looking in a mirror and you're all dressed up, and you feel that the body parts are so disgusting when they fall off the body, like hair on the floor is disgusting. Or like, there's spit in my mouth right now, but if I were to spit in my hand, it'd be just disgusting to everybody. But it was just in my mouth. So like, why is there this disjunction here? Like, what's going on? What kind of trick is the mind playing? You want to keep your mind on that range. And in order to do that, you have to have a measure of calm. Because if you don't have a measure of calm, it's just going to end up being thinking like it usually is, right? You start thinking about the body, then next thing you know, you're thinking about your body in the grocery store with your grocery list, and I think about the laundry that you have to do. So similarly, with some we would call like samatha topics or calm topics, like the breath or the Brahma Viharas or something like this, where you're focusing anything where you're focusing on a single object. It's also important to have the Vipassana quality because there's various ways in which you can focus on a single thing, various perceptions you can hold in mind without changing. And some of those will be more conducive to calm than others. Some ways of attending will be more conducive to calm than others. And not just that, say like some levels of focus. You can focus in a very intense way. You can focus in a lighter way. You can make your awareness more broad. You can make it more sharp. So there's all these various ways in which you can adjust the way in which you're focusing, even on a single object. And being able to evaluate whether those are successful and being able to be creative in the way that you apply them to be successful, that's an aspect of Vipassana. So that aspect even needs to be present in samatha topics. So in order to be successful in the samatha topic, you've also got to have Vipassana. So these two things in the Pali literature are more qualities of mind that you bring to bear to succeed at any meditation topic, rather than say like two distinct ways of meditating.
So what you're saying is that from your investigation of the original Pali scriptures, that they're basically two different categories of topics, and that the Vipassana one is more related to the analytical aspect, and the Samatha one is more related to the results of a calmer or more placed mind. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, there's even ones that are in the center, like Buddhanusati, Dhammanusati, Sanghanusati, and those you're both contemplating, and it's also an element where you're developing faith. So it almost has these equal measures of what you might call, for lack of a better word, both samatha and vipassana. Other ones are more focused on the samatha quality of mind. Others are more focused on the vipassana quality of mind. But it's really a continuum. So yes, you're right.
So would you say that the vipassana quality of mind is the discriminating aspect of mind, and the samatha quality of mind is the pacified quality of mind?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, I mean, you could even say it's more like the vipassana quality is like the prefrontal quality, the discerning quality, which you mentioned. And, the samatha quality has to employ the subconscious more.
Ah, interesting.
There's just different angles.
Yeah, it's very interesting because everyone describes them differently. And within the Tibetan tradition, we have all of these different definitions, and we differentiate between them. For example, we do talk about the analytical aspect of meditation. We talk about shamatha, but there's something else we call laktong. It's often translated as vipassana, but it doesn't really match the descriptions that I hear from other people in the Theravāda tradition, which actually agrees with what we say about these meditation types. Very interesting, but I mean, to get into that conversation, to get into the nitty-gritty of meditation, is going to take us another hour, and we don't have time, unfortunately. But it's been really wonderful speaking with you. I just was wondering, did you ever meet Bhante Joe? He's a French-Canadian monk who spent a long time in Sri Lanka. Perhaps he wasn't there when you were there. He's from the Burmese tradition.
Never met him, no.
No, okay, that'll be interesting. We interviewed him on the channel, so that was a really fun interview, that one. So now, can you just maybe, to wrap up, can you give a little bit of advice for those people who are maybe not necessarily beginners, but Westerners who want to find their way on the path and are frustrated. Many are frustrated because they don't have the opportunities. They say that the opportunities don't exist, or they're confused about all the various different presentations that are available for them online. So from your own experience, from your own investigation, maybe you could just leave us with a few words of wisdom, a bit of advice on how to progress on your path in a kind of efficacious and meaningful manner.
Yeah, well, I think, say, for the typical Westerner who may be confused about various presentations of Buddhism, it's going to be important to use the strengths of Western culture to evaluate for yourself which presentation you think is most accurate. So it is a strength of Western culture, this debate and this analytical, this analytical faculty. And you can use that. I mean, you can look at the source text. You can, first of all, you look at what your goal is. My goal is happiness. You know, my goal is the ending of suffering, if that is in fact your goal. If your goal is just well-being, it doesn't really matter as much. I mean, you can you can kind of do a little meditation in almost any tradition, and you're going to develop some well-being. You know, you don't even have to be a Buddhist to develop well-being. You can keep the precepts and develop well-being in just about any religious tradition. So if your goal is specifically the ending of suffering, then you want to evaluate the various theories you hear about how to reach the ending of suffering based on, you know, what you think is a reasonable criteria. So if you were converted by the Buddha, then the Four Noble Truths is going to be the criteria. If you were just inspired by a teacher, then the decision is going to be a different one, because essentially you're following a teacher out of faith. So, I mean, just follow them. And you want to evaluate in that sense whether you're actually progressing in good qualities, declining in bad ones, and developing dispassion. But always, I think that you can base yourself on your strengths as a Western person. You can learn to analyze whether you're actually progressing or not. And you can also take a deep dive into the doctrines of the tradition that you're practicing in and see really for yourself, do these really feel like they're lining up? And why do I feel like they're either lining up or not? And then whatever tradition you end up in as a result of that analysis, you're probably going to have strong reasons for being there. And those strong reasons for being in that particular tradition, taking on that particular mode of practice, that's probably what's going to help to see you through some of the tough phases in practice. Like, you know, things get tough, you know why you're there. You've got a goal, you haven't achieved it, and you know why you're using this particular path. You're on this particular form of Buddhism to achieve that goal for a reason. So I think that's going to give a lot of strength, using the intellectual faculty. In addition to the intellectual faculty, you also want to have this heart faculty, which is something that's not as well developed in Western Buddhism, but is an important aspect of the Buddhist path, which is that if you're going to take on a particular mode of practice, it should feel right. You know, it should just feel right. And, you know, Westerners have the capacity to evaluate that too, because living in the West, I mean, we have friends. I mean, you meet somebody sometimes, you just like them, and you go and hang out with them and you develop a friendship. And later you find out why sometimes you like them. Sometimes, oh, okay, we've got these similar characteristics, but I just felt a connection right away. I don't know why. Or, for example, types of food you might eat. There's just this huge variety of food in Canada from almost every culture. Some types of food you eat, you might eat it right away. It's, okay, this really agrees with my stomach. I can see this really fits. Other types of food you eat, it's, okay, this one is not for me. But as you learn to sample all these various types of food, you develop a pattern in your mind of why you like certain types of food and why you don't like others. So this instinctive aspect where something just feels right is another important element of tuning the compass so that it's pointing you in the right direction. And also so that it can get you over those humps, those difficult times in practice where things just don't seem to be going well. And over the hump is a new horizon. So I would say to use both those things. As a Westerner, you can base yourself on your strengths, base yourself on the analytical faculty if you're used to developing that, but also use it to develop this intuitive faculty, this subconscious faculty, and both of those can help to point you towards the goal that you're aiming for.
And thank you very much for sharing those wise words, and I'm sure they're going to be very helpful for many people on the channel. I hope that again, sometime in the future, we might be able to have another discussion if you've got the time, if we can drag you out of the forest at some point.
That's great. Lovely to speak to you.
Yeah, nice to speak to you again. Till next time.